Sorry. Go ahead, please.
Okay. I'm honored and it's a pleasure to introduce Richard Greenblatt, today's speaker. Richard majored in biochemistry at Cornell. For doctoral studies, he joined an eminent group of experimental neurophysiologists and theoretical neuroscientists at MIT, where he investigated the visual system of octopus and the spiking activity of neurons in the auditory system of frogs in response to their tape-recorded mating calls. As a postdoc at University of Wisconsin-Madison, he studied the mating behavior of beetles under the influence of airborne pheromones. Moving to the Jules Stein Institute at UCLA, he made extracellular recordings in toad retina, experimentally manipulated desensitization responses to preconditioned light flashes, and computationally modeled the results. This led to his position as programmer for the group. Then he moved to the physics department at UCSD and published an influential hypothesis for the structure of voltage-gated sodium ion channel proteins in excitable cell membranes. Importantly, this work also involved computational modeling. Next, Richard landed software engineering and scientist positions at Biomagnetic Technologies, one of the first MEG companies in the world, but one that suffered from boom and bust cycles of investment. After a bust cycle, Richard began to develop electromagnetic source estimation software out of his garage, and he landed an SBIR from NIH to get his own small company off the ground in the early 1990s. I was working for an EEG company at the time and was sent to a brain mapping meeting in Havana, Cuba, where I met Richard and had memorable discussions. With additional SBIRs and software sales to brain researchers, Richard grew his company in the 1990s. I joined the group later in 2000, and Richard's affiliation with the CSRC began in 2004. When he retired from business in 2011, he shifted gears from human neuroimaging to what might be called computational economics. I don't know what you would call it, Richard, but for example, Richard published a paper in Physica A titled Rates of Profit as Correlated Sums of Random Variables. Therefore, since Richard's computational interests range all the way from macromolecules to macroeconomics, he is eminently qualified, even as an outsider, to provide a perspective on the current situation we all find ourselves in. I'm looking forward to your thoughts, Richard.
Well, that was far too generous. I mean, I would summarize it by saying that I'm intellectually promiscuous, and we don't have to worry about details. So let me share the screen, and we can get started here. Okay, whoops. Uh-oh. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so what I want to talk about in this presentation are three major topics. The introductory portion, I want to talk about the biology and pathophysiology of the current pandemic. Then I want to devote the bulk of the time to talking about two different computational models and put them in a somewhat broader framework of the kind of models that are used to study this sort of problem. So one is a deterministic SIR model and the other is a Bayesian, which we'll call the ICL model. I have a feeling that that's going to take all the time we have, but if there's time left at the end, I'll say something about what people have referred to as the crisis within the crisis, that is, the economic crisis within the pandemic crisis. And I'll stop in a few places to allow some time for questions when we make the transitions between the major sections. So I don't know why, but my screen chooses not to advance here. Okay, here we go. So first I want to just make sure that we're sharing a common vocabulary. SARS is the name of a disease, the severe acute respiratory syndrome that became a threat around 2003 and later on 2008. COV is the name, is the coronavirus, which is the family of viruses that includes the specific virus, the SARS-CoV-2, that causes COVID-19, which is the disease that we're going to be talking about. An epidemic is a widespread infectious disease in a particular community or region at a particular time, and a pandemic, which is what we're in now, is a super regional or global disease outbreak. Okay, so I'm sure there are other words. So this is a nice, in my opinion, diagram of what the virus looks like. It essentially has two major parts. The outside is the envelope, which in turn consists of a lipid membrane and the spike. The lipid membrane is why washing your hands with soap works to kill the virus, because the soap dissolves lipids. The spikes are what binds to the cells, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the RNA is what carries the information. This is an interesting virus because it's a so-called positive sense RNA virus. That is, it not only is the genetic material in the form of RNA, but it actually doesn't even have to be converted into DNA to be replicated. So it uses an RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. Okay. So if you imagine that blue box in the center to be a representative cell in an infected patient, what happens is the virus uses the spikes to bind to ACE2 receptors, basically a hormonal receptor, which has a very widespread distribution about the body, which helps to understand some of the symptoms of the disease. And then it fuses with the cell membrane using some additional proteins on the surface. And the RNA then goes into the cell where it then codes for the production of the necessary viral proteins, and also where the RNA is replicated, it then fuses with the endoplasmic reticulum to form the completed virus, which is then expelled into the intercellular space and is able to diffuse through the body. So while we think of, or at least I used to think of the disease as principally a disease of the respiratory system that affects the lungs, that's probably an oversimplification. That is, the disease, and this is one of the things that makes it so dangerous, is a multi-organ disease. It eventually becomes a disease of the immune system. And in fact, the pathology that's associated with the respiratory distress, with the pneumonia, is probably largely a response of the host organisms, the respiratory host organism, that is people's respiratory system. And this has become particularly significant because on the bottom of the slide, it mentions this pediatric multi-system inflammatory syndrome. And this is something which has been recently observed in a small group of child patients, and is a clearly immune system response to the viral infection. Okay, so but the main cause of death with the disease is at the level of the alveoli, which are these little sacs in the lungs where gas is exchanged. That is, as the blood flows in through the capillaries, the CO2 from the blood goes into a healthy alveolus, which has air trapped on the inside. And then the air then transmits oxygen into the capillaries. But what happens when you have an infection with this virus, between the effects of the virus and the effects of the immune system, and what's sometimes referred to as a cytokine storm, the cells of the alveoli break down, and the alveolar compartment fills with fluid, sounds like a very unpleasant way to go, I think. So anyway, that's my brief introduction to the biology. Are there any questions about that before I move on to the epidemiology and the modeling, which is the main part of the talk? Okay, I don't see anything. If you want to, you can post things in the chat, which I probably will not pay attention to, but maybe we can come back to them there in one of the subsequent breaks. Okay, so in discussing the epidemiology, I would like to talk, I'd like to break it down into two parts. The first part is a continuation of the biology that I just talked about. I want to just talk about some observational data about the epidemic, a number of cases, number of deaths, and so forth. And in particular, although this has not been so much of an issue now, it was an issue when I started preparing for this, which is the coronavirus actually worse than the seasonal flu? And I think there's some strong epidemiological evidence that that's very likely to be true. And then I'll talk about the modeling approaches. So this is a graph which shows something like 18 countries and New York City. And it compares the seasonal, the deaths as a function of time over the course of the years, this blue line, versus the deaths from the virus itself. And what's interesting about these is in the majority of cases, for example, here's the UK, this was done before the lockdown, there's about a doubling in the expected death rate. And in New York City, it's actually something like 7 times higher. France is about twice as high. In some cases, like Norway, in Austria, Germany, largely because of the interventions that they've used at a public health level, they've been able to keep the death rates to within the expected values. And then there are other countries where all death rates also have tended to be low. Portugal, for example, where it's not clear exactly what's going on, at least to me. So this is one way of arguing that the virus is substantially more dangerous than the seasonal flu. Another one is to look at the US mortality rates. This is not only true in the US, but it happens to be easy for me to find these data. That as of today, about 95,000 people have died from coronavirus in the US. This is comparable to the highest 2 flu years since the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. But the difference is that this year there was a partial lockdown in the United States, and most likely, if there were no precautions taken, the death rate by now would have been 2 or 3 times higher than that. It would have been 200,000 or 300,000. So I think all the evidence points to the fact that this is a serious problem, a serious public health problem. And I don't think this is a controversial issue at this point, except among a few people on Facebook. So, but here's one other, I think, useful piece of data. This comes from a study in Denmark looking at the Danish population. We all know that the older you are, the more likely you are to die of the disease. And but what I didn't know until I saw these data is that actually the likelihood of dying for the coronavirus as a function of age pretty much maps on to the likelihood of dying from anything as a function of age. So there's nothing special about the coronavirus, except insofar as there's high transmissibility in nursing homes, for example, where there's not a good level of care. Okay, so this is, I guess, the main part of, the beginning of the main part of what I want to talk about. And I'll start by saying that in Europe alone, there are at least 40 different models. And certainly if you then add on top of that the United States, China, Japan, Korea, and so forth, there are probably 100 different models that epidemiologists are using to study the disease. There are only a few different types, and I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to provide some sense of how you can classify the models, and then talk about two of them. So one of the ways to think about the models is, are they deterministic or are they stochastic? And if you look at this slide on the left, these bunch of models, the SIR model, the SEI model, and so forth, are essentially deterministic models that are based on representing the virus spread by ordinary differential equation as a function of time and other parameters. And I will be spending some time looking at the SIR model because A, that's foundational. B, it's really the first of the mathematical models for epidemic spread. And third, because it actually exposes some of the key features of any of the other models. In particular, probably people have come across the notion of R naught, which I'll talk about, and which derives directly from the SIR model. Then if you look at the right-hand side of this figure, there are basically two rectangles on the top and one down below. So these are the stochastic models, but the ones on the top are mechanistic or at least partially mechanistic. And what means by mechanistic is that you can look inside sort of and see what happens, and what happens seems to be connected, is intended to be connected to some more or less realistic representation of what's going on. The box on the bottom that starts with nonlinear regression are also stochastic models, but these are essentially black box models that attempt to make some sort of fit to the data. And I'm not going to talk very much about those. What I am going to talk about is one of the Bayesian inference models from the Imperial College, London. All of these models are essentially population-based models. But it's also possible to talk about agent-based models and look at social networks, for example. So where it sort of parallels the distinction in economics between macroeconomics and microeconomics. So I'm going to talk about two macro models, SIR and the Bayesian model. Okay, so to get started on the SIR, this was developed in a series of 3 papers between 1916 and 1918 by Ronald Ross and Hilda Hudson. He was a physician and sometimes referred to as a closet mathematician, and Hilda Hudson was in fact a mathematician. So it's called the SIR model because it divides the population into 3 different compartments. Those people who are susceptible to the disease, those people who are infected with the disease, and those people who have recovered from the disease. In this particular case, if you die from the disease, you are considered to have recovered. SIR. And I suspect partly the reason that they formulated the model in this sense is it was simple enough to be able to address it analytically. So for people who are familiar with chemical kinetics at all, it's easy to have an intuition about this, that the transition from susceptible to infected depends on 2 factors. Or 3 factors. It depends on the number of susceptible individuals, the number of infected individuals, and some rate constant beta, which is the transition constant going from susceptible to infected. And so the transition, the rate of change from the susceptible to the infected population is given by an expression where the number of susceptible people decline as a function of these three parameters, two of which are constants. And then, of course, the infected population increases as susceptible people become infected and decreases as they recover. And finally, the recovered population increases as the infected people recover. The thing that makes the dynamics here interesting is this bilinearity in an SI, and that gives the dynamics some useful structure. Okay, and in fact, it's very easy to simulate this model on a computer. It took me like 5 lines of code in Python to write this. So, and in the next few slides, I'm not going to be talking about the number of people. I'm going to be talking about the proportion of people in these various categories, which simplifies the problem slightly. So I'm not sure if you can see the green line down at the bottom, but that's the infected population. And I assume that 0.001% or something like that of the population was originally infected. Obviously, there has to be something that initiates the process. And so what you see is a kind of exponential decline to a maximum, and then exponential decay that goes down to 0. And I'll, well, actually, before I say that, so the reason it's going down to 0 is because the susceptible population declines to a low number, and the recovered population, which is assumed in this model to develop immunity once you've had the disease, rises to a high level and remains there. So that's actually the basis for talking about the reproduction rate at herd immunity, which is what I'll come to next. First, I'll point out, though, just that the so-called beta, the transmission rate, is actually, you can think of it as being broken down into 2 parts. That is, the number of contacts that an infected individual runs into in the course of the period when they're infectious, and the transmissibility is how many of those measures. Whoop, I didn't mean to go backwards. Okay, how many of those contacts actually result in an infection? This will become useful possibly later. So intuitively, it's reasonable to think that the number of people that are going to be infected at any one time depends on how many people are getting infected versus how many people become immune at any period of time. And that ratio between these 2 rate constants is given by, it's defined to be R0, or the basic reproduction number. And this is something that you frequently encounter in the popular literature when people are talking about epidemics. You want to keep R0 down below 1, and I'll mention something about that. But the possibly more significant number is the effective reproduction number, because this takes the basic reproduction number, which you could think about as sort of being the physics, and combines it with the fraction of patients, fraction of individuals who are susceptible. So obviously, if that fraction of individuals are susceptible, who are susceptible decline, then the effective reproduction number is going to decline as well. Fewer diseases will be encountered. And it leads to what is come to be known as the epidemic threshold theorem. And the theorem has 2 parts, which I'll just state. I'm not going to spend the time to prove it. That if the effective reproduction number is less than 1, then the number of infections as a function of time decreases monotonically to 0 as t goes to infinity. So if you get it down below 1, there won't be an epidemic. However, if it's greater than 1, and this was the example that I showed a couple of slides back, then the number of infected patients starts to increase. It reaches a maximum and declines to 0. There's a single critical point. It reaches a maximum and declines to 0. So I'm going to skip over proving that. And do you have I have a yellow, oh no, a yellow box there. Oh, it's going away. Okay, so if the, oh, please move this video away from the shared application. I have no idea what that means. Am I the only one who's seeing that? Well,
okay. I see it too, but I don't know.
Everyone sees it.
Everyone sees it. Well, if it gets too annoying, I'll try to fix it. But meanwhile, I'll just try to keep going here. So, okay. So this is a graphic representation of the results of the reproduction theorem. Here I've simulated 2 different conditions where in one case the forward rate constant is slightly less than 1, where the recovery rate is 1, and the other case where the reproduction, the forward rate constant is slightly greater than 1, where the recovery rate is still 1. And you can see the numerical representation of the results of the reproduction theorem, that in the case where beta is less than 1, it declines monotonically to 0. Where it's greater than 1, it reaches a single maximum and then declines essentially exponentially to 0. Okay, this also allows you to understand the question of herd immunity. Up on the top here, there are some symbols that if you rearrange a little bit, you can basically write down a simple algebraic function that relates the reproduction number, the basic reproduction number R naught or R sub 0, to rho, which in this case is the fraction of people in the population who have recovered. And what you can see is when R naught is between 0 and 1, that you don't have, there's no need for immunity, herd immunity, because you simply won't have an epidemic. As the reproduction number grows greater than 1, this curve also grows, and it divides the plane into 2 portions. Those portions above it will be immune and there will not be an epidemic. Those portions below it have a reproduction number which is sufficient to produce an epidemic. So if you go up for the case that we're talking about, for the the coronavirus, I'll show the evidence for this later, but the R naught is on the order of 2.4, varies from country to country and depending on how you make the measurements. So if you simply go up vertically from 2.4 or 2.5, you can see that in order for herd immunity to develop in the population we're talking about 60% of the population will have to be immune. And that could either come from a vaccine, which doesn't currently exist, or it could come from infection and spread of disease, which is the situation we're in currently. So taking that together with another piece of information, which is the so-called infection fatality rate, which again, I'll talk about later. It looks like the infection fatality rate is on the order of 1%. That is 99% of the people in at least the US population who get the disease survive. 1% do not. That suggests that for the US to attain herd immunity will take between 1 million and 2 million fatalities. I find that to be a somewhat troubling number. Okay, so I just want to add, one could make a slightly more elaborate model where some of the infected patients post-recovery lose immunity, and then you can get these sort of rebound effects. And finally, I've already talked about the infection fatality ratio or rate, and you can get that from an SIRD model where you have susceptible, infected, recovered, or dead, or you can simply infer it from the data, or it's just defined as the ratio of the number of deaths from the disease to the number of recovered from the disease. Okay, so to summarize the SIR model, it's a deterministic ODE model. The importance of it lies principally because it's foundational for epidemiological modeling. Understanding this is the gateway to understanding the other more recent, sometimes fancier, maybe better, maybe not. So it provides both a qualitative and a semi-quantitative understanding of the epidemic dynamics. It defines the reproduction number. It explains herd immunity quantitatively. However, it's simplified and omits potentially significant states and flows. Okay, so are there any questions about the SIR model before I move on to talking about one of the Bayesian models? Silence, crickets. Okay. So the ICL model, they refer to as a semi-mechanistic Bayesian model. I would call it, it's primarily a mechanistic model, and I'll show you what the model looks like in a slide or two. And I'll also say a little bit what I mean about it being a Bayesian model. So the objective of this model is, or one of the objectives is to be able to answer the question of how does the reproduction number change as a function of time following non-pharmacological interventions. So that's been principally, I mean, the pharmacological interventions, that is taking drugs, have not shown that any of them work. And the virus, I mean, the vaccine, if there is one, will not be available for months. So the interventions like social isolation, like lockdown and so forth, are examples of these non-pharmacological interventions. And we do want to know how effective these various interventions are. And this model can give us a handle for looking at this. I want to say it's mechanistic because, as you see, it suggests a sort of physical model for what's going on in the spread of the epidemic. And it's Bayesian in the sense that, and I'll be a little more symbol manipulating with this later, but from observations, it makes some guesses about what the prior probabilities are for the parameters of interest. And then it uses those guesses along with the available epidemiological data to make some estimate of what the posterior distributions are, for example, for the reproduction number. And it, like other similar models, it uses a variant of the Markov chain or MCMC solver, which I'll say a little bit about. Okay, so this is an orange thing here. Well, we'll just have to live with it. Okay, so the main part of the slide here is a qualitative graphical description of how the model has been conceived. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll talk about how the various quantitative portions get grafted onto this conceptual model. So there are two things to take at the beginning. One is the hypothesis that they make that the most reliable observation statistic are the number of observed deaths. So they're going to use that number to make inferences about what they're interested in. And in this case, although you can do other things with this, in this case, they're interested in estimating the time-varying reproduction number. Time varying is a function of non-pharmacological interventions. So in order to do this, they need to be able to model, which is what's going on down here. They need to be able to map the deaths from the model, compare them to the deaths from the data, and use that to adapt the model. And they need to be able to look at the non-pharmacological interventions, of which they're considering 6, which I'll come back to what exactly those 6 are later. They're also doing this on, I believe, something like 15 different European countries. So they're assuming that some effects are shared by all of the countries, but these effects, which are going to affect R sub t, the time-varying reproduction number, will be specific to individual countries because the times at which they're introduced, and even whether or not they're introduced, vary from country to country. Okay. Oh, and I should say, I'll say this at the end. So working down, what I've tried to do is highlight the portion of the model on the left-hand side here. Sometimes it'll move around, and the statistical assumptions that they're making here is on the right. So deaths are discrete, and so they're using a discrete probability mass function to model the likelihood, the probability that a specific number of deaths occur. They can then compare that to the observed number of deaths on that particular day for that particular country. This strikes me as something which makes sense superficially. I've had trouble justifying it in a deeper sense of what the negative binomial distribution is supposed to represent, but I don't think that that's an important problem. So moving down the chain, we can then, look at how the modeled deaths are affected by the modeled infections. And basically they're making a fairly simple model. It's somewhat similar to the beta equals kappa tau separation that I talked about with the SIR model. Here except that here we're talking about a transition from infection to onset, and then that is when you actually develop the disease, and then onset to death. So this is it's a sum of 2 different gamma distributions. If people are unfamiliar with a gamma distribution, it's a widely used distribution that is somewhat similar to a normal distribution, but all the values are positive, and so it has an asymmetry. And it's defined by 2 parameters, which could be the mean and variance, or the rate and scale, or various other things. So we had 2 parameters from the death model. We now have 4 more parameters from the infection model. And now we come to what may be thought of as the heart of the model, which is how do you, we now have a way of estimating, if you know how many infections there are in a given day, we can now estimate how many deaths are going to be at some subsequent date. So the question is, how do we get to the number of infections on a given day. And the sort of master equation for that is this discrete convolution, which depends on three factors. One of them is the R sub t, the effective reproduction number. And this is the number that we're after. This is the point of doing this. And then it basically says that the number of infections on a given day depends on the number of infections on some previous day, C sub tau, and the likelihood. I'm using likelihood and probability carelessly here, so excuse me if I do that. But anyway, it's the probability that an infection on some previous day is likely to result in an infection on a subsequent day. And this is what they call the serial interval distribution. It says that on the average, it's going to take 5 or 6 days. The peak between the time somebody gets infected and somebody passes it on to somebody else. That's the G of t minus tau. This in turn is going to add 2 more parameters, the mean of 6.5 and the variance of 0.6. So we've got this side, assuming that we can bootstrap this, is basically what they do, to get the system started. So we have C sub tau and G sub tau. What we don't have is R sub t. And R sub t now is going to depend on the interventions, which, for example, lockdown or closing large-scale social gatherings, closing schools and so forth. So this is going to be given by essentially another empirical function, which basically says for each of the interventions, of which there are 6, the probability of it happening is given by some unknown alpha sub k for each of the k interventions. And we're going to assume that alpha sub k, again, is for the priors, is given by a gamma distribution. And now we have only one additional thing to estimate, which is R sub 0 or R naught. And they simply assume that R naught is normally distributed with a mean of 2.4, which is the number that I was using earlier, and some variance, which in turn is also normally distributed. So if you go through and add up all of these, if I add it up correctly, there are 24 independent variables that we need to solve for. So we're going to be working inside a 24-dimensional space. Okay, so the problem is we have the data, we have the model, and we have the priors, which are these gamma distributions and so forth that I pointed to. So from these data, we want to find the most likely model parameters that explain the data. And not surprisingly, since this is an exercise in Bayesian inference, we're going to look at Bayes' rule, which basically says that what we're looking for is the posterior, which is the probability of the model parameters that we've selected, given the data that we have. And that's going to be the probability of the data given the model, which is typically calculated as a likelihood function or a log likelihood function. And the priors, that is the probability distribution that we guess. And in these cases, I should say, even though the data were based on these 15 or so European countries, the priors were determined from Chinese data. So they had a pretty good starting point, especially since they're presuming that most of these are properties of the epidemic, of the disease, rather than properties that have a national distinction, although to some extent that's obviously going to be true. People live in different conditions and some of these will vary. So the solution to this is given by Markov chain Monte Carlo methods. I'm not going to have the time to spend, I don't think, talking about this, but it's an interesting area, partly in the history of science. These methods were originally developed to study problems in statistical physics. And but this is in the 50s, and then it was later adapted by various other people and produced variants of the basic model. But in 1990, Gaman and Gaman, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, realized that this model, which had been around for 40 years, can be used to solve Bayesian inference problems. Graphically, this is the way the model works. I've shown it for a 2D case where the solution space is only 2 dimensions, but like I say, in the ICL model, they're actually something like a 24-dimensional space. So basically, what the way the model works is you choose a starting point, and you choose a rule for moving forward, which is Markovian in the sense that it's conditionally independent. That each move is independent, both of it, the previous move and of the subsequent move. And then you have a rule which says if the model is moving towards a higher probability, then you accept the move. If the model is moving to a lower probability, you accept the move with p less than 1, depending on how far it diverges from a move in the right direction. And this is a nice property. This is why it's actually a useful algorithm, because it allows you to explore the space and not get trapped in local minima. So that initial part is called the so-called burn-in step, and then once you have that, then this particular picture assumes that there's a single local maximum, and this is one of the limitations of the so-called metropolis algorithm that was first developed. But assuming there's a single local maximum, what this will do is it will walk around the local maximum. So there are 2 points to be made here. One is this is different from, for example, a simplex algorithm or a gradient descent or something, or simulated annealing, where the goal is to find the peak. Here, the goal is not to find the peak, but to find the distribution. And in this case, using the MCMC algorithm, the distribution is defined implicitly. That is, you never come up with an equation which represents it. You just can sample that distribution, and that's the information actually that you need that will give you the mean and the confidence intervals, which was the purpose of really this whole exercise. Okay, so here's the results that they've gotten by, I say, looking at something like 14 or 15 different countries. And the conditions that they're considering are lockdown, public events, school closure, self-isolation, and social distancing. The 6th one is the sum of all of the others, so we won't worry about that. And what you can see, the further you are to the right, the greater the effect is. And I'll show it later for a couple of different countries. So here you can see that the lockdown has the greatest effect, and it will drop the reproduction number by 75%, which in fact is enough to bring R sub t down less than 1, given this particular virus. And so the lockdowns will prevent the emergence of an epidemic, or at least tamp down an epidemic that has already started. The only other one that has a major effect is the closing public events. There was, for example, a football game in Milan where 80,000 people attended and then spread the virus all over Lombardy a few days later. That was sort of a disaster. What's interesting is the others have a measurable but a small effect. So school closure, self-isolation, and social distancing all have a small effect. They were unable to differentiate them because they generally occurred in times that were very close to one another. But presumably their effects are cumulative. So, okay, and then I think this is the last slide on this section, which takes examples from 2 different countries. The 3 graphs on the top are for the UK, and the 3 graphs down below are from Sweden. And the point of choosing these 2 countries is that Sweden, in some ways the UK is typical of the European countries that I showed before. Sweden is an outlier in that they have not had a lockdown, although they've had the other interventions. And what you can see is from the estimate of R sub t in the 2 graphs on the right, that in the case of the UK, when the UK locked down, which was in the 3rd week of March, the time varying reproduction number dropped below 1. And you can see that, in fact, there was a significant decline in the number of deaths, both the empirical data for the number of deaths and the model data for the number of deaths. In Sweden, however, where probably everybody knows, they have avoided a lockdown. They have been unable, perhaps intentionally, to keep R sub t, they can't get R sub t to go below 1 using the social interventions that they're currently using. And the result of that is that the death rate in Sweden has continued to grow. Okay, so the summary of the Bayesian model, and I think I'm not going to be able to have time to go beyond this, is that you can use the Bayesian inference to estimate hidden variables. This is basically it's an inverse problem. Given the data, make some inferences about what's going on underneath the hood that you can't observe directly. And obviously confidence intervals emerge naturally from the analysis because the result of the analysis is an implicit probability density function. And thirdly, the effects of the interventions, lockdown, social isolation, and so forth, can be inferred from the data. So it makes it a very useful model. Okay, I was going to say the policy guidelines. I mean, just to go over it briefly, I think I put this here because I felt like it was implied by some of the data. And the basic ideas are these are at least my ideas, and I would say the ideas of most of the people who are doing the epidemiology as well, as opposed to the people who are doing the politics, is maintain the lockdown till R sub t gets below 1. In other words, you're into the region where the epidemic is going to be declining, and then relax the restrictions incrementally. In order to do that, you need to be able to test, you need to be able to trace contacts, and you need to be able to isolate contacts. And this will allow an incremental reopening without having the reproduction number jump above 1 if you do it properly, if the number of tests are available, if you can contact trace infected individuals rapidly and maintain social separation. So we need to be prepared, as far as I can see, for this lasting for months or longer. It may possibly diminish with the heat warming, the temperature, but there's no particular reason to believe that one way or the other right now. And the last thing is, this is not going to be the last pandemic. This has already followed on Ebola, on MERS, on various other things. And we need to be prepared. And this is one of the problems that I think not only the United States, but other countries had as well. South Korea was somewhat of an exception, Vietnam another exception. that were prepared, were able to test, and were able to prevent the virus from spreading, even though there are breakouts. Okay, so are there any questions on the Bayesian inference model, the ICL model?
Can we ask a question about the two models?
Sure, please. I only
You
meant
can
that
ask
as a
questions
suggestion.
about anything.
Yes.
And Richard,
What?
since we're not gonna be able to go for a beer, so we have plenty of time for questions.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, maybe then let's take the questions we have now, and then if you want to, we can continue and just briefly go over the political economy.
Actually, I have an abnormal beer in my fridge. Me and Kurt, we're going to have an abnormal beer fest afterwards.
So are you suggesting we just keep the Zoom going and share a beer?
Correct.
Oh, okay. All right. I should say.
See, we're prepared.
Yeah. Well.
You guys aren't.
Yeah, maybe you were more foresighted than I. What I was going to say is you can ask any old questions you want to. There's no guarantee that I can give you an answer that you'll find satisfactory, but at least I'll try not to fudge too much. So somebody had a question.
But also look at the chat. Look at the chat. There is a lot of questions in the chat that you should take a look.
You know, it's not up on my screen.
No, but you can bring it up. But let me ask.
Okay, let me go to more.
First.
Just stop sharing.
Is there a way to? Is there a way to include the sheltering or the social distancing or the different factors that you get an importance measure of with the Bayesian model in the SIR model? Is there a way to do that, and how would one go about it?
Yes, I think that you can do it. The issue is how you use the ODE solver, because a simple-minded ODE solver just assumes a set of initial conditions and then runs till you tell it to stop. Basically, what you need to do is, are you familiar with, for example, SDEs or SODEs? These are stochastic ordinary differential equations. And those you can solve by essentially similar numerical methods where you can modify what you might think of as the initial conditions as you go along. So in the case of these interventions, you can start your server, then you could add essentially a delta function at some point and allow it to move on. So the issue is, it's not a computational problem. The issue is having the data. I can't tell you in those list of models which of them do something like that, but some of them do. I can show. I have a graph that I can show you later where something like that is being done. I neglected to mention one group has a PDE model, which I find a little odd, but they're also trying to represent not only the time varying character, but the spatially varying character as a continuous 2D function. Did that answer your question?
Sort of.
Sort of. Okay. You can do it. The answer is you can do it.
If you have a model where you're changing the initial conditions every day or something, and then reinitializing the model and then running it, are there any problems with it becoming chaotic, or
That's an interesting question, and I don't have enough experience to tell you. I haven't read anything that suggests that that's a problem. I mean, people do the SDEs regularly using something like what I was describing. But there, what you're typically doing is you're adding Gaussian noise with each step. And the Gaussian noise is generally a fairly small value compared to the variables of interest. probably if it became chaotic. Well, yeah, it is. That's really all I can say about it. I don't have experience here.
Hi, Richard.
Yes, please.
I have a question. Based on the public data you have, let's say, what's the number of R sub t equal now is right now?
Well, that depends on the country. The way they did the model is they assumed that once there was an intervention, that the RT had was fixed until there was another intervention. So in the case of the United Kingdom, RT went down below 1. In the case of Spain, I'm sorry, in the case of Sweden, it did not. And here's some, let's see. Oh yeah, okay. This is an interesting graph because this shows the death data in the United States. And presumably as the number of deaths have been declining due to these various interventions, this suggests that RT has fallen below 1. However, there's this one or two interesting studies. This is the ICL model up here. This is a Columbia University model. This is a modified SIR model where they've done something like what the previous person was asking about. That is, they assume that you have, you're following the existing dynamics until you reach a point around here where the lockdown is removed. This is essentially what our president is proposing. And when they change the parameters to take that into consideration, what they find is that the virus starts spreading again, which of course is completely consistent with your intuitions. If you're not going to control it, and if there's only a small percentage of the population which is resistant to the virus, then as you remove controls, you're going to increase the spread. So I can't tell you exactly what the effective reproduction number is here, but I'm guessing it's on the order, it has gone down from something slightly less than 1 to something somewhat greater than 2, so around 2.
Ah, okay. So that means roughly just one person will infect 2 persons.
Yes, that's the way that's typically presented. I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. You could go back and do some simulation that sort of confirms that. Yes, it's certainly greater than 1 in this case. And as I say, the number of patients is a few percent.
Yeah.
Less probably in the US.
Okay.
Okay, are there more questions? Okay, well, it's kind of up to you folks as to whether I should say anything about the economy or whether we should just wrap it up at this point.
Yeah, I would like to hear what's your economic prediction.
Okay, well, yeah, okay, so I mean, we've talked about this as a crisis and a crisis, and obviously the immediate cause is that the lockdown has caused a business slowdown and led to a historic increase in unemployment. Obviously, the disease would have done something similar, but because there was a lockdown, we haven't faced that situation yet. So here, instead of plotting the unemployment rate, which is what's typically done, I'm plotting the employment rate as from about 1950 to the present. And by plotting the employment rate, you see a couple of interesting things. Of course, it plummeted. It plummeted to about 50%. But it plummeted from a level that never reached the level that we started out in the 2008 recession. And nor did we reach the level in the 2000 recession. And I think this is something that's important, and I'll show some other examples if we have time, that we're beginning from behind, so to speak. Each time since, both in 2000 and 2008, just measuring the employment rate, we never return to the previous values. And what I believe is that what I'm calling pre-existing conditions, as if it were a clinical phenomenon, are important in understanding what's going to happen as the economy develops over the course of the next several years. So in the short term, the government has actually obviously done some stabilization, both fiscal and monetary, and they're now willing to produce these basically huge deficits, which is why I'm saying that we're all post-Keynesians now. Everybody believes in borrowing large amounts of money at very low interest rates in order to prop up demand. And this is not only true in the United States, it's interestingly true in Europe, where France, and in particular, What? Oh, I must have gotten a resonance or something. That Germany, who was the pillar of austerity, is now proposing that the EU spend 500 billion euros, I think, on propping up the European economy in the short term, including even countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain, and so forth. So the short-term effect, even though I know several people who've lost their jobs and some of whom are in danger of losing their housing, the short-term effect has been mitigated by these phenomena. I think that the long-term outlook, I'm personally relatively pessimistic. When I started working on this, I didn't have an opinion on it. And what I'm finding is, as I become more and more convinced of my pessimism, what I'm reading is that more and more economists who are writing about this seem to be saying something similar. So I suppose this is a view that's worth taking seriously. And there are basically three reasons, I think, to be pessimistic about it. One of them is the residual pandemic effects. I think I'll say a little bit about this in another slide, that even though the bottom fell out very quickly, some of the effects of the pandemic itself are going to last for a period of months or years, especially if we can't control the disease. Then there are the pre-existing conditions in the US and other national economies, and I pointed to one of these with the question of the employment rate drop not ever actually fully recovering. And the third thing is that this is, if looking at it from a US-centered perspective, this is not simply something that's going on in the United States. Everybody knows this is a global pandemic and a global crisis. So in 2008, the Chinese economy, although this wasn't the sole factor to end the recession, the Chinese economy was able to play a significant role through infrastructure expenditures in pulling the global economy out of recession. This isn't going to happen this time. In fact, I read today that at the National People's Congress, I think it's called, they decided, I think it was Xi, said that there's not going to be any target for GDP growth in China. This is the first time in 30 years that the Chinese economy does not have a target GDP growth. And I think it's principally because of the uncertainty. They just don't know what the Chinese economy is going to do. And the Chinese economy and the US economy, as everybody knows, are the two principal economies in the world. And neither of them are looking really good right now.
Richard,
Yes.
I heard that they approved that they're going to issue 1 trillion Chinese
Yuan
currency.
RMB?
It's called I think a pandemic bond.
Yeah,
To find it, it's a $1 trillion, I guess.
I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised. Did they announce that today? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense, and it's consistent with what everybody else is doing, and it will have a short-term effect, a positive effect, undoubtedly. So that's a good piece of news.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I already talked about this these data. So this is the residual clinical effect. That if we relax the restraints prematurely without having appropriate testing and isolation and so forth, we're going to get a resurgence. We're very likely to get a resurgence of the disease. But then there are also socioeconomic effects that are going to last beyond the disease. That is, social behaviors will only revert partially and with an unknown lag. For example, in my neighborhood, restaurants are going to open on Monday. I was talking to one of the restaurant owners and I told him, I'm not going to be there. And he was saying, yeah, we're expecting really only 10% of our customers are going to show up. The same thing is going to be true with shopping. It's going to be true with traveling. So there's going to be a long memory, especially of people like me who feel vulnerable, that we're not going to want to take unnecessary chances. Also, it's clear that the work from home is going to continue at higher levels than it was before the pandemic. And one of the effects that this is going to have is on the real estate sector. There'll be less demand for commercial properties, and that's going to have it's going to put a load on the economy. At the same time, there's going to be an increased tendency for automation and computerization where it's possible to replace employees with machines. This has already been going on, but the pandemic is going to accelerate that process. Also, state and local governments, especially at the local level where like San Diego, depends very heavily on sales taxes and to a lesser extent on the hotel tax. These revenues have already collapsed and will only slowly return. So there's a real problem with funding state and local governments. And this is one of the contentious issues at the federal level right now, is to have, because the federal government can essentially borrow an unlimited extent of money, limited only by the rate of inflation, whereas state and local governments are restrained to maintain a balance. So if the federal government doesn't step in to help the states out and the local governments, they're going to be in a serious situation, and that's a topic of debate and disagreement within the Congress right now. And then finally, I think one of the things that's going to happen is that the large corporations are going to ride this out better than the small businesses will, partly because the federal government support to the large corporations, I'll mention a little bit later, has been substantially kinder to them than to the small businesses. And so there's going to be a reorganization of the economy and an increasing concentration of centralization. More Googles, more Boeings, fewer, or bigger, I should say, not more, but bigger. And smaller businesses are going to suffer as a result. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about some of what I was calling the pre-existing conditions. And I already showed it with the employment data, but here's the GDP data for the US, and I've plotted the real GDP, and that is adjusted for inflation. And I've fit from about the end of World War II till the most recent data that I was able to get. I fit all of the data to an exponential, and you can see that there's a significant gap that in effect, the economy never recovered from 2008. So the economy is already behind. The employment is one instance, the GDP gap is another instance. Here are two more instances. These are actually probably correlated, but one is the Industrial Production Index, which is a number that the Federal Reserve calculates. I don't actually know the exact definition of it, but you can see that about a year ago, the industrial production in the United States basically flattened. And then with the onset of the pandemic, it dropped substantially, and it will continue to drop. This was from, I think I got this 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm sure it's even lower now. But the point here is that industrial production had already declined. And the other thing that has declined is capacity utilization. That's why these two things are correlated. It basically says how many more people you could hire without having to invest more in fixed capital. So there was a dip, a sort of mini recession a few years back. Now it had already started declining about a year ago, and now it's dropped off. So a supply-driven response to this recession isn't going to happen because there's an excess of capital goods. Okay, so then the third thing is the financial markets. And the financial markets are really, really unstable right now. And this is the principal job of the Fed and why they've been printing trillions of dollars in order to stabilize the financial markets. It's interesting also to note that this is something that predates the onset of the pandemic, because as early as late November, early December, some of you may have read about the so-called repo problem. And this is something that was one of the precipitating factors in the 2008 financial crisis. Basically, banks borrow overnight funds and they put commercial paper up as as collateral. And typically that collateral is exchanged for money from money market funds. What happened in 2008 was that the banks and the money market funds stopped trusting each other. And so even this overnight lending, which is normally almost frictionless transaction, came to a halt. And I think this is finally what took down Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. And this happened again in the end of 2019. However, the Fed was aware of it, and they basically printed a bunch of money and started buying up the repo paper, and then the crisis ameliorated. But the financial instability that lay behind it is still there. And the other thing that's going on is this problem of over-leveraging. And this is something that particularly affects the larger corporations, that when profits go up, they borrow more. And following the 2008 recession, there was an increase in profitability until very recently, at least. And the result is that there's this mass of commercial paper, bonds specifically, that are in danger of default because people aren't buying planes, for example. People aren't buying cars. People aren't traveling, all of these things. This has caused the Fed to do something that they've never done in their history before, which is over 100 years, which is to buy corporate bonds. And like I said, they have more or less unlimited capacity to do so, but the fact that they're forced to do something that they've never had to do before is a sign of the instability in the financial system, which they will need to manage very carefully in order to prevent things from getting worse. So, okay, so here are my conclusions. The pandemic is both global and dangerous. It's probably the worst since the Spanish flu. Delays were costly. In each country, it's not just the United States. For the United States, if people had responded even 2 weeks earlier, there would probably only be a third of the number of deaths that there are now. And in the United States, what I would argue is that the pandemic is still not under control. Being a computational modeler, I'm going to argue that modeling can be helpful in understanding the data, but there are two caveats. There's no such thing as a good model, but some models are useful, so you have to be a little critical in evaluating the data and among the models. And also, this is a really big problem, is the access to data. It's not just for modeling, but even just to get a sense of where we're headed. The fact that it's been difficult, even until now, to obtain the necessary testing makes it very difficult to make informed decisions. And there's no real excuse for that to have happened. In South Korea, for example, it didn't happen. And then lastly, the COVID-19 recession is global, and it's likely to be deep and long-lasting. At least that's my hunch right now. And this is not a cheery end, but this is how I feel. We just need to adjust to the new normal. So, okay, here are three, if anybody wants to follow up on this, here are three sources that I found to be particularly useful on the modeling issue. There's this paper by Howie Weiss, which is available online, which I used for understanding, for example, the proof of the reproduction theorem, or even the statement of the reproduction theorem. It's available from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. The Flaxman paper, these folks are from ICL. They seem to publish a new preprint every 2 or 3 days. But this particular one, which was published 3 weeks ago, I thought had a useful derivation, basically, of their modeling, and I felt like I was able to use their description to understand what they were doing. And the third one, for those of you who would rather not read, this is about a month ago, but I'm sure it's still topical. ECMI is the European Council on Mathematics and Industry. It's like the European SIAM, and they had a 2.5-hour webinar with 5 or 6 different statisticians describing, and these were all people who were actually working not only on developing the modeling, but also working with their respective governments to organize the response to the pandemic. So I found that to be a particularly useful and easy to listen to introduction, even though, whatever. And then, okay, so thanks. This is the end of my talk. And I also want to express my gratitude to the healthcare workers and the other essential workers, like the people in the grocery store that I go to that I can get food from. So normally I would say, are there any questions? But we already did the question. Are there any more questions or comments?
Yes, does anybody want to see me drink an abnormal beer?
Probably not.
Well, I'm gonna probably. Oh, there I see you drinking a beer. What makes it abnormal?
Hold on, just a second. Says abnormal.
Oh, I see. Okay, that's a brand.
And there's a big A on it. Okay.
Okay, so well, I'm gonna pass on joining you. Although, is there anything else?
Well, Richard.
Yeah, just in case you were wondering where the brewery is, it's very close to the Society for Computer Simulation International headquarters, in the same mini mall as the Society for Computer Simulation.
In where?
Mini mall. It's in Rancho Bernardo.
Oh, it's in San Diego County. Okay.
Okay, Richard, I just want to thank you for a very, very illuminating talk. And there is a lot of things in the chatting that is worth looking at. We're going to have this, this is recorded. So you're going to have a chance to look at it. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Okay,